Welcome at the table. Always hard to say the first word after such a powerful film like that and such an extraordinary personal story. I promised you before the film that I would introduce our distinguished guests who have also powerful personal histories, and so I will do so, and then they will each have the floor. Our first speaker will be Tjitske Lingsma. I practiced that several times. And a prize-winning journalist and author, winner of the 2009 Dick Scherpenzeel Prize. Witnessed these events in 1999, was there actually when the world around her was burning, experienced that sense of personal danger as a journalist, has worked for several presses, AD's Algemeen Dagblad, Elsevier, Amnesty International, Vrij Nederland, and CNN, to name a few. She's also reporting now on the International Criminal Court. And our second guest, I would say almost fresh from Phnom Penh, is Michiel Pestman, who was the defense lawyer for Nieuwe, brother number 2, who was the right hand to Pol Pot at the Extraordinary Chambers of Cambodia, a hybrid forum, hybrid court. He spent 1 year, the last year there, has left feeling disappointed that his client is not getting a fair trial. His colleague Victor Koppa has now taken over that position, and he will speak in a few moments about his experiences there. He does write a regular column about his experiences in Cambodia in the Dutch magazine Advocatenblad. And so, without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Tjitske, and then we'll move right on to Michiel, and we'll have a little bit of time for discussion and questions. Please.
You can hear me? Yeah? I won't give a review of the documentary, although I think it stops at a very convenient moment. The marriage of Shanana Gusmao and Kirsty Swart not only consisted of romantic love, it's not always easy to be the wife of a very charismatic leader. I must say that I'm very sorry about a recent sad development. I'm going to say it here because it's on my mind. Just before Christmas, Kirsty heard that she was diagnosed with breast cancer and she's being treated in Australia. I read that she's doing well, and let's hope that she will recover. There's another reason to note that the documentary ends at a convenient moment just after the violent birth of a nation. Building a destroyed country is a process marked by mistakes, trial and error, conflict of interests, and many painful dilemmas. While we saw lovely scenes and kind of peaceful scenes, though Shanana was imprisoned, the terror in East-Timor continued. During the occupation, 200,000 people died in East-Timor, and that is while the population was 600,000, so that is 1/3 of the population. So it tells you something about the extreme terror by the Indonesian authorities and army in East-Timor. And let me take you back to 1999, when the long, brutal occupation ended in extreme violence. During that year alone, between 1,500 and 2,000 people were killed. And after having lost the referendum, the Indonesian army and Timorese militia razed the country to the ground, burning at least 70% of the infrastructure and many houses. East Timorese were looking for lost family members, friends, neighbors, because just after the popular consultation, some 250,000 people, which is again 1/3 of the population, were deported to West Timor. There was no economy, no work, no government, no shops, no schools, hardly food or medical help, no services like electricity or running water. East Timor was in complete ruins. The UN sent in a mission that would govern East Timor for 2.5 years. UNTAYED has almost colonial powers, but many of its staff were unqualified, and within a few months much of the respect for the UN had gone. This is the context in which the complex process of justice was supposed to take place. I remember how early 2000 the first Timorese judges and prosecutors were sworn in. One can wonder about the quality of these judges and prosecutors, but at least it was a start. In the meantime, the UN had set up a serious crimes unit to do criminal investigations. But certainly in its early years, the unit faced problems such as severe mismanagement and a lack of funds. And while the UN in New York had rejected the possibility of an international tribunal for East Timor, the special panels were set up, a hybrid domestic international mechanism to prosecute genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, but also murder, rape and torture. During his visits in the country, Shanara Gusmao, however, did not call for prosecutions. He called for amnesty. He said the Timorese should forgive and concentrate on building their lives and the country. In 2001, the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation was set up. A team of Timorese and international researchers investigated the violent events during the 24 years of occupation. One of the interviewers is here today, and she's, I think, so there in the audience. Her name is Lily van Rooyen. The Commission also arranged reconciliation sessions during which lower-ranking Timorese militia members would confess their crimes to their communities. In Indonesia, attempts were made as well. The national human rights organization Komnas HAM published a report already in January 2000. It confirmed the terror in 1999 was the result of a systemic campaign of violence, and 33 suspects. 2 years later, Indonesia set up an ad hoc trial. 18 persons were prosecuted, including officials from the Indonesian army, not the top members of that army, the police, civil service and Timorese militia leaders. But in the end, all were acquitted. In 2005, the governments of East Timor and Indonesia set up a joint commission for truth and friendship. Its goal was to establish the truth about the 99 events. Nobody expected much of such a mechanism, set up by two governments who had not been quite famous for campaigning for justice. But when the Commission published its report, many were surprised that at least it did conclude that the Indonesian forces were mainly responsible. Other than that, it did not much for justice nor for reparations for the victims. In East Timor, the Serious Crimes Unit, in the end, indicted a total of 391 persons. Just 87 suspects were tried, which led to 85 convictions. They were all, except for one person, Timorese. Many have been released by the Timorese government in the meantime, including notorious militia leaders. The Indonesian masterminds were never brought to account. Things were not going well in East Timor, one of the poorest countries of Asia. In 2006, a conflict within the Timorese army spiraled out of control. The police, youths and gangs became involved against the backdrop of a massive political crisis. Thousands of people fled their homes, houses went up in flames, and at least 25 people were killed. International troops were flown in to restore order. A large group of rebelling soldiers had escaped to the mountains, and then in the morning of 11 February 2008, trucks with rebel soldiers came into Dili, the capital city. I shot President Ramaphosa, who you just saw in the film. He was critically injured, but survived. In a separate incident, Prime Minister Gusmao was also shot at, but he escaped unharmed. Until today, it's unclear of what exactly happened that morning. The event is surrounded by secrecy. After a turbulent decade, in 2009, East Timor commemorated the historic referendum that led to its independence. The events during that day shed some light on the delicate matter of justice in East Timor. It was hot that morning, the sun was burning. Guests from East Timor and abroad were waiting while seated in the shadow of two covered grandstands. The ceremony at the square in the front of the presidential palace in Dili, by the way built by the Chinese government, should have started already half an hour ago when a rumor started going around. The delay seemed to be caused by the Indonesian delegation. Finally, the ceremony began. President José Ramos Horta, who had been in exile himself during most of the occupation, started his speech. He spoke about history and reached out to his fellow Timorese who had suffered so much, just like his own family. He recalled the efforts of the truth commissions in revealing facts. And this is a quote. He said, "The greater good, the greater justice is that we are free today. And with this gift from God, we must forgive our brothers and sisters and those in the Indonesian army who committed heinous crimes against us." He went on to say, "There are some voices at home, but primarily abroad in the West, calling for an international tribunal for East Timor." He did not agree with that. He said, "I'm saying let's put past behind. There will be no international tribunal." He pointed at a sensitive issue, the atrocities that were committed in the past by the East Timorese resistance movement. Should an international tribunal, he said, try only East Timorese militia and Indonesian military and not the resistance leaders? Ramos Horta argued it is up to Indonesia to prosecute its own perpetrators, and he stressed that many countries had never seen an international tribunal anyway to deal with the past. During the reception afterwards, a shocked UN official came to me and whispered, "Do you know why the ceremony was delayed? Indonesian officials refused to come if Bere would not be released." Just a few days earlier, the East Timorese authorities had captured militia leader Maternus Bere, who had slipped over the border, was recognized and arrested. He was being wanted for murder, rape, kidnapping and deportation during the same referendum which was cynically currently being commemorated. But the Indonesians protected him. Only if Bere was set free and safely handed over to the Indonesian embassy, Indonesians would participate in the ceremony. Prime Minister Gusmao ordered his release. There was an outcry from politicians and human rights organizations, but the deal was done. Last week I emailed a Timorese friend, himself a survivor of the Santa Cruz massacre that you saw pictures of during the film. He said people still want justice, but he wondered what campaigning for justice would mean for the relationship between the two countries, with Indonesia being the closest and main supplier of affordable economic goods to East Timor. The leadership, he said, is trying to shift the mindset of the Timorese to work for economic development and strong economic cooperation, he said. He feared that campaigning for justice would involve all sorts of complexity with its neighbor. East Timor made at least some efforts to do some justice for the 99 crimes. Last December, 3 militia members were sentenced by the Dili court. But the Indonesian perpetrators, including the mastermind, are left untouched. Good relations with Indonesia, security, economic development, and silence over atrocities within the Timorese resistance are more important. Indonesia has been obstructing justice, and the future does not look well. An ex-commander of Indonesia's special forces, accused of extreme human rights violations during the occupation, is planning to take part in the next elections, trying to become the president of Indonesia. The title of today's seminar, Unfinished Struggle, is well chosen. Justice, it is just a simple word of 7 letters, and despite our feelings for fairness, it is a hugely complex issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tjitske. And thank you for pointing out the complexities of the transitional justice process, which bear a resemblance to some of the questions we've seen with South Africa, with Serbia, and with several other post-repression, post-transitional justice societies. So before we discuss that, I'd like to move on to another post-repressive transitional justice discussion. Please, Michiel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel like the old one out here. I knew very little about East Timor before I watched this film today. I was asked to talk very briefly about my experiences in Cambodia and transitional justice, as it's called. And I'm willing to do so and answer questions, of course. But maybe first explain what I was doing there. I was defending Nieuwe. Nieuwe is currently on trial before the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. I am no longer representing him. One of my colleagues is there now. I withdrew from the court and I'm no longer acting on behalf of my client anymore because I do not believe that the court in Cambodia can deliver justice, or as we say, a fair trial to my client. I left early this year, and there's many flaws to the system in Cambodia. It is a hybrid court like the courts in East Timor were, but it has basically one major flaw, and that is that in every chamber there is a majority of Cambodian judges and only a minority of international judges. Combined with a government which is not democratic. Most people in power, the Prime Minister, the President of the Senate, the President of the Appeals, the General Assembly, are all former Khmer Rouge fighters, and indeed my client knows most of them, some of them, for more than 50 years. Political interference has been rife, and there's a very strong feeling, at least I do have a very strong feeling that the outcome of the trial will not be determined in court but by the Cambodian government. That is why I decided to leave. Of course, the question is not why did I leave, and will my client get a fair trial? It's very relevant to me, but here tonight the question is, does such a court still have a purpose? And I believe it does not have any purpose. It's not serving the purpose it is supposed to do. There was a conference in September, I believe, or October, about the legacy of the court. They always do this. International courts organise legacy conferences. And I was originally invited, but then I was still allowed to go, but it was taken over by people who were obviously there to promote the court and to explain to everyone that it was such a big success, which I think it's not. The original intention was to show, among other things, to show the Cambodian people how to run a proper court, how to run an independent court. But you can see the opposite has happened. The corrupt judicial system of Cambodia has basically taken over the court, and the Cambodian system is teaching the international community how to run a corrupt trial. And you can say that the UN has been corrupted by this system. And I'm not the only one saying this. There's many people who believe that this court should never have been established. If you look at the website, if you visit the website, one of the things they're very proud of is that more than 100,000 people have visited the trials, have attended the trial. I think they can fit 500 people in the court, and almost every day the court is full of people who are, one must realise, buzzed in from all over the country. It's a form of forced displacement, as we used to say. People come because they have to, and they're offered free meals, but they do not come because they want to be there, and I doubt whether they understand what is going on in court. There's more than 3,000 civil parties. People always mention that fact as an important thing. More than 3,000 victims, civil parties are allowed to participate in theory, but in practice they are completely marginalised and they are poorly represented. And they're not allowed to say what they want to say. They pure window dressing. The most important civil party, the first person, the first victim to join the proceedings has retired and withdrew from the proceedings before the trial, in my case, started, saying that it was a circus, a charade. And she gave a press conference and she sent a letter to the court with one word on it, enough. And she withdrew, and she's still there giving press conferences, trying to explain to the foreign press and media why this court doesn't work. And we are very close, and it is telling that counsel for the main accused and the main victim completely agree that the court is a farce. I do think international courts are important, and I think they can play a very important role in transitional justice. But one should realise that they're always very limited. They're often established by the international community and by governments in countries which have suffered, because they hope to set the historical records straight, to establish the truth, and to help reconciliation. But we should realise that defence lawyers are more interested in the truth. Prosecutors want convictions, and judges at best do not really understand what has happened if they want to. So we should abandon the idea that it helps to establish the truth, and I seriously doubt whether they can help to reconcile people. I think reconciliation is a much too complicated process to understand, and maybe courts can play a role. But in Cambodia, I think the influence of the court, or the effect of the court on reconciliation, is nil. Whatever people say, I do not think that it will serve any purpose. Maybe people will feel, on an individual level, victims will feel better if they see that the people they held responsible are locked up. But that is as far as reconciliation will go. We should not underestimate the power of revenge. I think that helps to reconcile people. Revenge is very important. But the main purpose of those trials is very limited, but not less important. I think the main purpose of those trials is to establish the guilt or innocence of individual suspects. And that is basically what those courts do. And as such, they play an important role. But establishing the guilt or the innocence of individual suspects is already complicated enough, and I think those courts should really try to concentrate on that very important thing they have to do, and forget about all the other things, which might be side effects of their existence, but should not become their main purpose. That's all I had to say in 7 minutes.
Thank you. You've both given very sobering views of several different mechanisms of transitional justice that have been employed in both of these places. If I understand, Michiel, one of your points is that revenge could help, but retributive justice doesn't seem to really be working. So I'm curious as to where one would actually, I mean, revenge might be considered to be found in punishment, but if retributive justice isn't working, I'm kind of wondering where the satisfaction of revenge might come in. I'm using the chairman's privilege to ask the first question, and I'll ask you both to briefly answer because I know that some other questions will come in. I was wondering, Tjitske, if there are other mechanisms that you think might be more effective in dealing with this repressive past than these different models that have tried and failed. Big questions, okay. But if you could just give a brief response first, and then we'll turn to the audience. So perhaps...
yeah, maybe you can
yes.
ask and then I can think.
Well, the people often ask me this question, how to solve the problems of Cambodia. I think most people who are there, specialists, psychologists, psychiatrists, who've studied the effects of the civil war. It's not just the Khmer Rouge regime, but there was a prolonged civil war. Agree that it's a society with what is best described as a post-traumatic stress disorder, a collective post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm not a psychologist. I really don't know how to cure those problems, and a court can help, but it's a drop on the hot plate. And translation of a Dutch expression. And I think the only thing that can really cure the problems that exist in Cambodia is time and economic development, and eventually democracy. But they haven't reached that stage yet. And I don't know whether a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would have been a better idea, because we haven't tried it. I don't know whether it would work in a Cambodian or Asian context. People think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa worked to a certain extent, but it's hard to predict what would have happened in Cambodia.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think you cannot undo the past, and I agree. It's also a very traumatized population, East Timor. I think the percentages are almost the same. 1/3 of the population died. So I think you can never. I actually think you can never solve that. I think it's impossible. But I am of the opinion that recognition of the pain is an important issue. So this Reconciliation Commission in East Timor, I think it worked to a certain extent, but it was never done in such a way as in South Africa, where I think most of us have seen at least some sessions. It was broadcast through the country. It got a lot of attention. And I think I feel some sympathy for that kind of mechanisms. And trials are just very limited. They're very limited in scope. They have a very, it's about, like you say, guilt, establishing guilt or innocence. But I think I would go. I think if I had my say, I would I think recognition of the pain, and I think a reconciliation commission that is working towards that works. And I would combine that probably with, if I had to say it all, with a good justice system, court system, because I think you need that. In East Timor, you have a saying now, people, that you better actually commit really big crimes, because that's better than stealing a chicken, because you can get away with mass murder, but not with stealing.
Kofi Annan said something like that too.
So I think for establishing the rule of law, democracy in the end, I think you need it. You need it. But I think there's not one big solution, because I think we would have found it already. I think it's just very hard, and I think it needs a combination of mechanisms and true will to do it.
So you would argue for a more victim-centered approach, and it seems that both of you have consensus on the limitations of the trial model.
Well, trials are not victim-centered at all.
Yes, I recognize that. Yeah. But those are two.
Yeah, they shouldn't be. But I don't think they should be.
No,
I think that the experiments in international criminal law to allow victims to participate have failed.
The jury's still out on that, I would say. But before we get into...
It hasn't given the satisfaction to the victims, for sure, not in Cambodia. And I doubt whether the victims at the ICC are very happy with their role.
I doubt it. I would agree. Well, before we get into further discussion, because we only have a few minutes left, I'm imagining, although I have to confess, I really can't see the audience.
No, I can't see
the light is rather bright here. I don't know if we can dim it at all. But otherwise, I'm going to trust Martina to find those who have questions, and please bring the microphone to them, and please say who your question is to be addressed to. I know several students are here tonight, and sorry, I'm expecting something from one of you, so please don't be shy.
I know it's always difficult to ask questions, especially the first one.
In Cambodia, I think probably justice will not come, but I am very satisfied to know that people like Yang Sari and Nonchea are in prison instead of leading a very nice life just they have been doing for so many years. So this is one little consolation to know that they are in prison.
Well, as I said, revenge is a powerful.
Yes.
But once you realise that he's still, he's still on trial, and the judge has not decided on whether he's guilty or not. So, and he did not have such a comfortable life before he was arrested. I think his life is probably more comfortable now than before his arrest.
This is also on Cambodia, since you say that most of the Khmer Rouge, old Khmer Rouge soldiers are still in government positions. Would you say that maybe a mechanism as illustration or rehabilitation would have been another option for the Cambodia, maybe? What do you think about that?
Well, the current government has done the Houdini Act. They self-rehabilitated them.
They rehabilitated themselves. But there were lower cadres or middle cadres. They were not in charge during Khmer Rouge times. But for sure, the people in power have a lot on their hands, maybe even more than my client, and which makes the situation very complicated. And the outcome, as I said, the outcome of the trial will be determined by politics, not by the law. It's a very complicated situation, and what they probably need is another revolution. I would not dare to say this in Cambodia.
Hello. Well, I was wondering, because you had a very negative attitude, I guess, concerning the ECCC, and that in this court perhaps only guilt can be established, but also as I figured from the comments you made concerning other courts, I thought, what is your view? Because I had, at least until now, more the impression that actually the achievement of other international courts concerning, for example, other forms of transitional justice, such as reconciliation or truth-seeking, is a huge achievement in other courts, because I think that the rights of the accused are at a very high level so far. If you see the ICC and the ICTY, the court's always very concerned with fundamental rights that are preserved in front of the court. So I thought, how is your view concerning the other courts?
Yeah. Well, I was only complaining about the ECCC. I think that ICTY has been fairly successful, and the ICC could be, although I have my doubts whether it will actually work, but that's not because the system cannot work, but for other reasons. And the ICTR, of course, was a success, and I think to a certain extent the special court in Sierra Leone was also quite successful. It's just this ECCC, which is a political compromise, which was doomed to fail. As everyone agrees who was involved in the negotiations, including the people representing the UN. So one should be very careful when one sets up. And I think after Cambodia, it's not very likely that people, and after East-Timor as well, it's very unlikely that the UN will ever agree to a similar hybrid court. And I think that we have invested, as the international community has invested so much in the ICC, I really think that we should go for the ICC and try to make that work. And put money into it, and not invest in hybrid courts, which are an invitation to governments to interfere with the process and to influence the outcome of the proceedings.
If I could just, did you not say that more local ownership of the process?
Well, I think the alternative, which I worked for in Sierra Leone as well, and I think that especially in Sierra Leone, which had a more or less functioning judicial system, contrary to Cambodia, where the judiciary is completely dependent and one of the worst in the world. But in Sierra Leone, there was a functioning, to a certain extent, a functioning judicial system, and what they could have done, instead of setting up a separate hybrid court, they could have invested in the existing court system. And they could have done a lot of trials themselves, I think. And I don't know why they didn't decide to do that. Maybe lack of confidence in the ability of the system to deal with so many cases against important people. But in Cambodia, that would definitely not have been a solution. I don't know what the solution for Cambodia would have been. I think it's good to try people. I think I'm not against the idea. But in Cambodia, I don't think this current solution works. I'm no witch doctor, I don't know. I don't know how to solve the problem. But the current solution, although I understand it gives some satisfaction to see my client in prison, although the situation, the circumstances are not particularly worse than when he was living in the jungle. Yes. Sorry.
I think I was just. Are there some other questions?
Maybe not a question, but an addition to what Tjitske said. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did have public hearings on several issues where people from all over the country could come, and there were representatives. And they dealt with issues like political prisoners, women who were being raped, children who were transported to Indonesia, and also on the issue of what happened in the first years of the resistance movement. Now, I think the problem is that the report, they try to spread the material of the CREA report, which is 2,000 pages, also in the countryside for children as educational material. And that never worked out. I think it's a lack of money. And also another problem is that the report was never properly discussed in Parliament. And I think that's a bloody shame.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think there are just many missed opportunities in that whole process. I think it could have done much better, in my opinion. That's what I think.
But whose fault was that?
Oh yeah,
Political, I think.
I think so too.
Another question from somewhere back there. Yes.
I only have a small question for Mr. Pestman. You mentioned you withdrew your work at the trial because you thought your client didn't get a fair trial. What do you mean by that, since you said the task of the court is to establish either guilt or innocence?
Yeah. Well, it was a very difficult decision, and I must say I was helped by the fact that one of my colleagues managed to take over, because I had basically abandoned my client. But I came to the conclusion that my presence there did not serve any purpose anymore. I had said everything I had to say, and was stopped on many occasions of saying what I wanted to say. And I really felt that I had no role to play in the procedure anymore. As I said, the main problem is that whatever I do or say or try to say is of no influence on the outcome of the trial. I'm not saying that he will be convicted for sure, but I do not think that whatever happens in the end, it will be the product of a fair trial where all parties have been heard and where independent judges take an independent decision. As I said, the outcome will be determined by political circumstances and considerations, and I don't know what the political considerations will be at the end of the trial. If it's in the interest of the Cambodian government to impose a very lenient sentence, will be imposed. If there's an interest to impose a life sentence, he will get a life sentence. It's impossible to say. It's irrelevant what I do, basically. It will not determine the outcome of the trial. That's what I feel.
And your colleagues?
Well, we respectfully disagree.
All right. Okay.
But I I spent a year there, and I gradually came to that conclusion. And he just left recently, so maybe.
Quite eye-opening that there was consensus reached between the prosecution and the defense that the chambers were not working.
Well, I don't think the prosecutor has publicly said that. But,
We understand that, but it's quite telling.
Yes, but the UN, who helped to establish the court, I spoke to several people, and they basically agree that it was a mistake to allow this to happen. Don't try this at home. I've toured Europe and giving lectures, trying to explain to people that this is not something to be repeated. The title was "Don't try this at home," and you know, I'm getting my own personal satisfaction as well. Fine.
Well, if I don't see hands from the audience, I'd like to, as we actually have to conclude this evening, I'd like to say that you have really contributed to our understanding from your experiences on the ground. At the beginning of the evening, I mentioned that we have a research program at the Nieuwe on transitional justice, and it's called Understanding the Age of Transitional Justice. And we, as historians in a law-dominated field, are trying to perhaps find different ways of thinking about these problems, whether it's the role of historians in the courtroom or testimonies as a form of oral history, or doing history, doing reconciliation. There may be more ways out there that we haven't yet conceived of. So we appreciate your offering your thoughts on what is not working, and we'll continue to think about what may work. So I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers for their contribution tonight. Thank all of you for being here, and again, the advertisement is on the wall. We hope to see you at the next evening event of this program. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
I did neglect to thank Martina van den Heuvel and Barbara Bolner, who organized this whole event. So if I could have an additional round of applause for these wonderful organizers.
Thank you for showing the film. I think it was a fantastic film.
Yes, it certainly was. Yeah.